Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Dr. Alexander Mikaberidze. He is a specialist on Napoleonic studies and the Napoleonic era. In 1999, Mikaberidze was one of the founding members of the Napoleonic Society of the country of Georgia, dedicated to the study of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, 1799 to 1815. In 2000, he moved to the United States to devote himself to Napoleonic studies. He has taught at Florida State University, Mississippi State University, and lectured on strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. Since 2007, he has been at the Louisiana State University in Shreveport. Professor Mikaberidze has been an author, editor, and translator of over 24 books and textbooks. His books, The Russian Officer Corps and the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, 1792 to 1815, and The Battle of Borodino, Napoleon versus Kutuzov, won the Literary Award of the International Napoleonic Society for 2005 and 2007, respectively. His most recent work on the Napoleonic Wars has been universally praised for its scope and breadth, and it will be our topic of discussion today. Of his recent work, Thomas Ricks of the New York Times Review of Books says, Alexander Mikaberidze argues persuasively in the Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, that the deepest and longest-lasting effects of the 23 years of fighting actually occurred outside of Europe. Welcome, Dr. Mikaberidze.
Thank you. Good morning.
I'm always interested in how an author chooses the cover of their book, and in yours, it looks like a pretty detailed piece of art.
Thank you. It is one of my favorite Napoleonic artwork. It's a wonderful painting by Louis-François Lejeune, who was actually a participant of Napoleonic Wars, served in many campaigns, witnessed many of the things that he later painted. And this particular one shows the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798 in July. And the reason I chose is because it touches on a couple of important elements in the story that I'm telling in the book. First, it underscores the international impact of Napoleonic Wars. Here we see the French fighting the Mamluks in Egypt with the pyramids in the background, and this campaign, the Egyptian campaign as we often refer to it, had enormous impact on what we now call Middle East and actually beyond. It's an homage, my own kind of homage to the Mamluks, many of whom were Georgian from the same small country as I am. So this way I'm killing two birds with one stone, or with one cover.
Well, it looks really cool. Professor M, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, in honor of Napoleon Bonaparte, we have Little Napoleon IPA from the Pensacola Bay Brewery in Florida. Now, Napoleon never actually set foot on Florida shores, but if he did, the people at the brewery in Pensacola Bay say they're sure that he'd be looking for a way to conquer that land from coast to coast, and, of course, be the envy of every presidential candidate who's ever campaigned in Florida. Having said that, if Napoleon had attempted to take Florida, he probably would have had some supporters. After all, the French had helped settle Pensacola. Now back to the beer. Strong and hoppy, just like the actual Napoleon, Little Napoleon IPA can sneak up on you if you let it. With a smooth caramel and honey finish, you'll want to have a second and maybe more. And remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. And this is also my chance to ask you to subscribe to the podcast simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use. We're excited to announce that the History A Go-Go podcast is now available on Pandora, too. As you know, I normally offer a cheers to the guest and to the audience before we start our discussion. But the French do not say cheers when making a toast. They instead wish good health to the person they are drinking with. Now, this goes back to medieval times, so what we're talking about here is a modern translation. What it actually meant was, I hope you didn't poison me, because if you did, I'm going to poison you. Now, that's not quite the same as wishing someone good health, but we'll take it. So in the French tradition, and with a well-meaning modern translation, I raise my little Napoleon IPA and say, "A ta santé." Napoleon is known throughout the world. I look at it and I said, okay, he comes from an aristocratic family. If I get something wrong, please correct me, Professor. But he comes from an aristocratic family. Most people know he was born in Corsica. Military education, becomes a military officer, I believe an artillery officer at age 16. It seems like a normal trajectory. What allows his ascent to power?
A short answer will be French Revolution, because it was such an event of such scale and enormity that it changed the direction of many people's lives, and Napoleon is just one of them. You're correct to point out that Napoleon came from a noble pedigree, even though the Corsican nobility was not particularly well respected, or certainly was looked down upon by the mainland, by the French nobility, for a variety of reasons. For example, the island of Corsica, where Napoleon was born and raised, was not integrated into French monarch in the French realm until 1769. In fact, Napoleon was born just a couple of months after the French conquest of the island. So the Corsicans were still looked upon as non-French kind of, Hicks from the mountainous island. And Napoleon, when he went to the military school, had quite a few altercations and quarrels with his classmates over this. The fact that he spoke French rather badly, with a heavy Italian accent, with a lot of Italian words mixed into that, certainly made him a good target for bullying. It is also that the Corsican nobility was kind of poor. So even though we talk about Napoleon being of noble background, it's worth remembering that the nobility did not necessarily mean money, and his family always was looking for ways to get a revenue flowing. And Napoleon, especially after his father died in 1780, was forced to end actually his training early at the great military academy in Paris, and start his career a year ahead of the schedule, because his family was starved for money and help. If things had stayed, as you talked about trajectory, right? If things had stayed that way, Napoleon probably would have peaked as a captain, maybe major. He would not have been able to advance beyond that, because the French military was, especially officer corps, was a closed caste for nobles, but nobles of certain pedigree and background. So the senior positions in the army went to the offspring of these well-known, well-connected, wealthy families, and Napoleon had none of it, right? As a foreigner with a funny-sounding name, funny accent, no money to speak of, he would have probably stayed somewhere in the junior officer ranks. But the revolution changed all of this, because it opened, there is this wonderful phrase, it opened careers to talent. In the midst of this profound turmoil, when France is besieged effectively by various European powers, when there's internal unrest, when you see more than 90% of the French noble officers fleeing from France, and there is a desperate need for capable men to rise up to the occasion and defend the nation, Napoleon repeatedly distinguishes himself. He shows on the battlefield what a talented man he is, and that earns him promotions. In 1793, in a span of 1 year, he went from a captain to a general, which is an astonishing rise in itself.
I love that quote too, and I can compare it to American history. Because I look at, well, in the French Revolution also, there are these characters that rise to prominence for one reason or another. Maybe it's their intellect, like Thomas Jefferson. Robespierre is a young man when he rises to prominence as well. I just really like that quote that you said.
Thank you. That's one of the great, I think, legacies of the both American Revolution and French Revolution. Although as a Francophile, I think French Revolution has a more pronounced effect in terms of the notions of equality. For many Europeans, American Revolution was an inspiration, but it was still something that took place overseas on the periphery. The French Revolution has a much more immediate impact, not the least because revolution was just across the border, but also because later on the revolution came to them. And there's this wonderful debate that the British had in 1790s on how to respond to the French Revolution. And the Prime Minister, Pitt, was giving this speech in which he was accused of waging war on ideas, since revolution was about these ideas, right? And so he famously says that he's not waging wars against ideas, but he's waging war against, quote, armed ideas. In that sense, this French Revolution has a much greater impact. But wherever these ideas went, at the tip of the bayonet, they did also bring these notions of equality and the opportunity, the careers indeed open to the talented and capable men, which is one of the great legacies of revolution.
I think that leads into my next question. What philosophies and aspects of the French Revolution does Napoleon specifically embrace?
In my book, I think I'm taking a slightly different approach to him because what I'm, usually when we talk about Napoleon, when we read about Napoleon, there is this debate always about, was Napoleon the child of revolution? Did he, save revolution, or did he kill the revolution? There is that famous quote that many books cite Napoleon as saying of Napoleon, revolution is over, I am the revolution. I'm not subscribing to that notion wholeheartedly. The way I look at Napoleon is that he's the last of the enlightened despots. And that's more of a historical jargon here. It's a reference to a series of rulers that came in the 18th century, the likes of Frederick the Great of Prussia, Joseph of Austria, or Catherine of Russia, and other lesser known individuals who wanted to use administrative reform, religious tolerance, legal equality, economic development to bring better governance for the people that would foster economic growth and prosperity without undermining necessarily their power. And Napoleon falls squarely, in my mind, into that category because he does not embrace revolution. He doesn't support all of the ideas of revolution. In fact, one of the things, some of the things he did after coming to power in November of 1799 was to constrain the revolutionary zeal, the revolutionary spirit. There is the famous scene when in August of 1792, he is in Paris and he witnesses the crowd, this revolutionary crowd of sans-culottes, right, the radical mass of the Parisian poor storming the royal palace and overthrowing the monarchy. And he looks at them, and his companion records that he looks at them in derision, and he says, "What a rabble! The king should have rolled out the cannon and shot them all," and which is what effectively he will do later on. So he is not necessarily supportive of all the revolutionary ideas, but there are some that he feels very strongly about, and those are the ideas that will ultimately be reflected in the Napoleonic Code that will be developed during his reign between 1804 and 1810. We oftentimes forget that Napoleonic Code is not just one piece of, just document, but there are multiple elements to it. And what we see here are the core principles of revolution enshrined, and that is equality before the law. He's very firm on that. It's about equality of opportunity. It's about the ability to own property without being restrained in terms of your rights and opportunities. And it's about tolerance, religious tolerance. And Napoleon himself was not a devout believer, even though, he was born Catholic, raised as Catholic. He certainly understood the importance of the church, but he himself was not a particularly devout person. That translated in some respects to that religious tolerance that he was so keen on enshrining. And that's where I think his support of the revolution really lies, and the notions of equality, civil liberty, the secularism are the crucial elements of revolutionary narrative that he supports.
Well, those are powerful concepts. And as you mentioned, wherever they go, I think you used the term at the tip of the bayonet or at the tip of the spear, they take hold. But running right along those ideas of equality, meritocracy, and economic opportunity is a feeling of nationalism. How does the Enlightenment ideals or revolutionary ideology develop into what appears to be rabid nationalism?
Nationalism is one of the most powerful ideology to come out of the revolutionary era. We can broadly define this ideology as the set of beliefs or ideas that argue that a group of people who share ethnicity, culture, language, religion, or a set of traditions, who have belief in the shared geographic location or piece of land that they believe was theirs, that they form a nation and that they should be able to govern themselves and develop this single national identity. And even though we think that nationalism, right, well, at least from our in modern perception, it has been around for a while, some may think, but it's actually a more recent phenomenon, historical thinking. And French Revolution plays a very important role in this. Because during the revolutionary era, when France was attacked from virtually every continental power, the French revolutionary governments began forging this narrative of one nation uniting in the war to defend the revolutionary legacy. So you see expressions like la patrie en danger, the motherland, the nation is in danger. You see the call for the national mobilization, as the French did in the summer of 1793 in organizing this famous levée en masse that tapped the resources of the entire nation for the purpose of fighting the war and defending the revolution. So that by the time Napoleon came to power, there is already in France the foundation of speaking on behalf of a nation, of a government being representative of not just one group of people, but rather of the entire nation. And he built upon it. But there is a second side of nationalism, so to speak. That is, when Napoleon conquered other areas, and he was quite successful between 1800 and 1808, in the span of 8 years, he effectively brings most of Europe under his control in different degrees of influence. So most of Europe is either ruled by the French emperor directly or is in some ways influenced by him. Well, those areas where the French came and they brought these ideas with them and began changing the local ways of doing things, actually were not welcome, because we may think that equality before the law is a universal and the universe should be universally embraced. But from a contemporary point of view, that was not so clear cut. The European society was quite hierarchical. And it's not just division of society into nobles and non-nobles, but it's also within even that commoner class, right? We see groups who have vested interest in maintaining the system the way it is. Just think about the guilds and the monopolies they had on certain crafts or industries. And if you have a foreign power coming and trying to dismantle the system, and it may look to us as a progressive step to create the open, right, careers open to talents and the equality, but for the contemporaries, it would not have seemed as clear cut. But it also, the fact that these changes, these ideas were brought by foreign power with a gun, with a musket, caused a reaction to them. One of the core elements of Napoleon's system, and I call it this Napoleonic package, was creation of a centralized, efficient government. Today, we might look at it as a good thing. We want to have a efficient government. We won't have a streamlined government. We would like to have a government that delivers on services and protects and makes the system run smoothly. But for many contemporaries, this new kind of governance that Napoleon promised was also intrusion, especially if you are not used to that kind of overbearing government that is always looking behind you and checks on you and actually holds you accountable to for the responsibilities that you have as a citizen. So if you have a government that comes and expects you to pay taxes on time, that might not be as amusing, right? And so what you see is a reaction. And the reaction oftentimes expressed as, who are we vis-a-vis the French? So when Napoleon goes into Spain and tries to bring those Napoleonic reforms, the reaction is a Spanish revolt. And one of the crucial elements of the Spanish revolt is this essence of, we are Spaniards. We are not French. Our way of life is different. Our tradition is different. Our language is different. Our society it should not be forced to follow the French way of life. And so that is a form of nationalism. The same applies in German states where Napoleon went, where the reaction was indeed the emergence of German nationalism. Or even in Russia, right? Probably the more conservative of the European states that Napoleon had to fight. But even there, you see the emergence of its own type of nationalism, where the French invasion of 1812 fosters this vision of Russia having a responsibility, this divine kind of mission to fight the heresy, the revolutionary heresy that Napoleon was spreading. All of this, right, later on coalesces into this powerful force of nationalism. And it is Napoleon that effectively ushers it in, that spreads it, that fosters it. But once Napoleon is gone in 1815, this nationalist stays around. And it is this nationalist force that plays such an important role in German history, where the German nationalists will try to build indeed a German state, and ultimately they will be successful in 1871. Or in Italy, where Napoleon, when he goes in Italy in 1796-97, sees more than half a dozen Italian states. He gradually takes over them, and then in 1805 combines them into Italian kingdom, giving Italians, for the first time in millennia, in more than millennia, since the fall really of Roman Empire, this sense of unity. And when Napoleon is gone, this Italian kingdom is dismantled by the victorious monarchical powers. But that memory of what unity was like, this memory of the sense of Italian identity and one nation survived, and you will see after 1815 this Italian nationalism evolving. So Napoleonic period played a crucial role in this.
So I recently spent a year in Saudi Arabia, and I was in Egypt also. And when I walked through Egypt today on the streets, I was in Giza, so I was very close to the pyramids, and I went to Saqqara and the ancient location of Memphis. But there's a great deal of poverty. I'm just wondering what impact, if I were to walk on those streets today and look around, are there any lasting impacts that Napoleon's failed invasion had?
That's a great question, because it's such a complex question. Napoleon's, and for the listeners, just to remind them, in 1798, in May of 1798, Napoleon led a massive expedition out of France to Egypt. It was an expedition that was designed to not as much invade India, as sometimes is popularly imagined, as it was to establish French presence in Eastern Mediterranean, in this broadly defined region of Levant, right? Spread, that included Palestine, that included Syria, and effectively to challenge the British commercial interests in this wider region. And initially, the invasion is successful. Right? Napoleon lands in Egypt on the 1st of July. It takes him about a month to defeat the local ruling elite, the Mamluks, and then try to bring that Napoleonic settlement, that Napoleonic package that I mentioned. And here we see same kind of problems that Napoleon will experience in other areas, and that is that these ideas, as progressive as they may seem to us, were not welcomed, were not embraced. In fact, Napoleon faced an uphill struggle in convincing the local population that had this profound gap in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of cultural mores and traditions, to embrace the ideals of the French Revolution. In my book, I argue that Napoleon's invasion of Egypt marked the first instance of liberal imperialism. That is, the invasion was of imperial nature. France was trying to create an imperial domain and grab Egypt as a colonial realm for itself. But it also had that liberal spirit to it, and that the Napoleon bringing the ideas of French Revolution reflected that. Now, it is a type of cultural imperialism, right? When you're trying to impose your ideas, your beliefs on another society. And the invasion highlighted the speed with which this French Revolution transcended not just France's borders, but also European borders. Here we are, just 9 years removed from the beginning of the revolution, and it is no longer a matter of France. In fact, it's no longer a matter of Europe, but it's also now being brought to the shores of Egypt. Even though the expedition was military fiasco, it did leave a lasting legacy. For starters, the invasion represented the first modern attempt to incorporate an Islamic society into the European fold. And so in that sense, it represents a crucial moment in relationship between the West and the Islamic world. It is a moment when the notion of Orientalism, with all of its ideological components, are finally being converged, and the full arsenal of instruments of what later on will be Western imperialism was employed to ensure French dominance in Egypt. And that includes military, it includes propaganda, it includes reforms, and so on. The occupation itself now did little to modernize Egyptian society, and that's where I think you touched upon the realities of it, right? Because the revolutionary principles that the French tried to introduce were too radical, too foreign. And in that sense, I've done, speaking engagements and lectures with our institutions of military education at West Point Military Academy or the Naval War College and elsewhere. And you see that the lessons that we see, or the experiences that the French had in Egypt actually have still relevance to our own experiences in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you see us try this nation building, right, and bring the notions of Western liberal order that are not embraced universally, that are confronted and resisted. So the French face the same thing in Egypt. Where I see the importance of Napoleon is that by invading Egypt and defeating the Mamluks, who had a long-standing control of this area, and then the French are themselves defeated and depart in 1801. Well, by doing all of this, Napoleon creates a political vacuum, and that vacuum has to be filled, right? And so by 1805, it will be filled by a maverick guy, a remarkable guy, by the name of Mehmed Ali. He's an Ottoman, that is a Turkish official. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire sends him to take control of Egypt. And Mehmed Ali will be able to consolidate power in Egypt, initially acting on behalf of the Sultan. But after 1805, 1806, he increasingly acts in his own interest. And he starts laying the foundation for a new kind of Egypt, and Egypt that will be reformed and modernized by borrowing key elements of the Western experiences. So here what you see is Mehmed Ali doing it much more cautiously, but also, selectively. He picks those reforms and ideas from the West that are designed to strengthen the state, strengthen the military, the administrative structures, and not those that undermine and challenge the social fabric or the religious fabric of society. And he's quite successful because by 1820s, Egypt will emerge as one of the most powerful states in the Middle East. In fact, by 1840s, it will have its own empire that will stretch from Syria down to Sudan, and from Egypt to what is today Saudi Arabia. And Egypt will play a crucial role in the history of the Middle East. And that's where I see, I think, the impact of Napoleon, more on the geopolitical restructuring of the Middle East, rather than necessarily changing the way of life of the ordinary people.
Now, if I can ask a personal question, then from my experience, I was in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabians do not have a particularly high opinion of the Egyptians. Do you think it goes back to that type of occupation from that time period? Could it be that lasting, or is it other factors?
There are multiple complex factors here, and it goes to both regional identities. But in the case of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, we have to bear in mind that there was a long-standing rivalry between these two, regions, two states, both not just in recent history, but even beyond. So think about Mehmed Ali, who effectively comes to power, consolidates his power in 1811 by organizing that infamous massacre of the Mamluks on the citadel of Cairo. But the cause for it was he was organizing an invasion of Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, in order to dislodge the radical group that we now call Wahhabites, right? Which is the official creed of Islam in Saudi Arabia today. So the very foundation of Saudi Arabia today, the religious fundamentalism there, the Wahhabism, was the very thing that Mehmed Ali actually was confronting and fighting. So there is that kind of the antagonism that goes back 200 years. And of course, the relationship between the two states only got complicated in more recent history, or not the least being over the issue of Israel and so on.
So if I can get back to Napoleon, you have the fall of the Directory, the coup d'etat in 1799. He is installed as first consul. When I hear that, it almost sounds Roman. I know I'm a neophyte in this discussion. But am I wrong in making that connection, especially with his background?
Oh, not at all. Napoleon was a great student of history, a very consummate reader of historical literature. As a young man, he aspired to write his books on history. He was famously told that young people should not be writing history. And now that I'm getting older, I see that.
You agree?
And rereading my earlier books, I see the point there. But he really, he's not the only one, but he really admired Roman history, and you see that actually among many revolutionaries, French revolutionaries, just as you see among the many founding fathers. Well, there is. There are many studies showing how much inspiration the founding fathers drew from ancient history, both Rome and Greece. And in Napoleon's case, he drew not just inspiration, but he borrowed elements of specific elements of Roman past. So, for example, the symbols of the French military after he came to power were eagles, which are styled after Roman eagles. And indeed, the title that he takes of a consul was an echo, a reference to the highest of the most senior position in Roman Republic, that of a consul. So you're absolutely right in drawing the connection between the two, because Napoleon, in many respects, saw himself as a man, especially in the later, in post 1804. He increasingly saw himself as a man who was building that universal empire that Roman Empire used to be. When, at the height of his power, when he controls virtually all of Europe, Napoleon indeed is like a Roman emperor, where, remember he was crowned, right, in the special ceremony like Charlemagne did, right, back in 1800. So there are multiple connections to Roman imperial past.
So the other aspect of Napoleon that happens is he gets demonized. He's even referred to as an antichrist. They compare him with Hitler. I don't think that's fair. Obviously, He caused a lot of destruction and war. But how about Napoleon as a progressive? Because he does push for better government. He attacks corruption, all of those things that were not received, say, by the Egyptians, for example. They are received in France, merit-based government positions, public education. I know the progressive era doesn't develop until later, but is Napoleon a progressive?
Again, it's a complex question, and then I think there is a ongoing debate over this, because in some areas he is, and in some areas he is not. We know that the reforms that he introduced during the consulate, that is the first 4 years of, almost 5 years after he came to power, from roughly 1800 to the end of 1804, we know that those reforms are probably the best examples of him as a progressive figure, as a constructive figure, as a person who consolidated revolutionary gains with the famed Napoleonic Code, reasserting these fundamental principles of revolution that I've just talked. I certainly don't see him as a power-hungry maniac. I see him, as I mentioned, more of an enlightened despot who masked behind the facade of democratic ideals. Because the constitution that he imposes on France in 1800 was a constitution that gave people the voting rights, even though it was behind the curtains, behind the scenes. The constitution effectively denied the choice to the people. So you can vote, but you can only vote for on a list of people that Napoleon approves. So here you have kind of choice, but you really don't have a choice. But within the context of the late 18th and early 19th century, considering the wider realities, I think Napoleon is a progressive figure. In the book, I'm arguing that was Napoleon's defeat necessarily a good thing? There's a lot of things that we can say about Napoleon that makes him an unappealing figure. He is a manipulator. He is ruthless. His actions in 1796-97 in Italy, where he held entire villages collectively responsible for the attacks on French troops and did sanction ruthless repression. His actions later on in post 1804, when he increasingly gains control of Europe, are also quite unpleasant to contemplate. He, for example, cheated right the Spanish monarchs famously out of their crowns. He had people detained arbitrarily and in violation of international law, as was the case in 1804 with the Duc d'Enghien, who was ultimately shot. He had booksellers, like the famous case in Germany involving the Nuremberg book publisher Palm, who published a critical pamphlet of Napoleon, who was detained, accused of subversion, and also shot. So there's many elements to him that are not as pleasant to contemplate, and he clearly is quite ruthless when it comes to politics. But ultimately, to me, is just weighing all these options, right? The good and the bad. And the way I see it is the Napoleonic conquest, while undoubtedly resulting in exploitation, hard repression, also brought with them reforms. They promised legal equality. They promised personal freedom. They brought inviolability of property, religious tolerance, administrative and judicial reforms. If nothing else, they brought standardized weights and measures. And whatever and however many his faults are, and undoubtedly Napoleon has plenty of it, to me, Napoleon was more enlightened a ruler than most of autocratic rulers that followed him. And so, to me, his defeat in 1815 is a setback for many of the ideals that we take for granted nowadays.
So the other aspect of your book that gets focused on is the rivalry between France and Britain. Now, the British and the French had been fighting for decades, centuries, I guess. But did that have to continue? Is it just power? Because it appears that a lot of the same movement to more liberal philosophy are happening in England as well. Is it just power that in past conflict that causes this rivalry to continue? Was there any way for the two to come together as the most powerful ground force and the most powerful navy? If there was that some sort of relationship or understanding, he could have been in power for much longer.
That's a very interesting question, a very broad question. You're correct to point out that these two countries, these two nations, these two realms have been engaged in protracted animosity towards each other. And by the time we get to Napoleon, nowadays we look, in hindsight, we look at Napoleonic Wars as part of the Second 100-Year War that Britain/England and France waged. We see that in the Napoleonic Wars as part and parcel of the conflict between these two countries that started in 1688 and that will be ultimately over in 1815. And here, what we need to see, what we need to bear is that these are the two countries that are in the process of empire building. So yes, power plays a crucial role in all of this. The Napoleonic Wars can be boiled down to these two nations seeking to empower themselves by dominating those neighboring powers, neighboring states. And Napoleon browbeat and hassled and abused his neighbors, but so did Britain. For example, I can bring your listeners' attention to what the British did to Denmark twice in 1800s, when the British Navy twice attacked the neutral Denmark as a way of really beating it right into accepting the more pro-British stance. In 1807, when Denmark insisted on neutrality, British actually sent their Royal Navy, bombarded the Danish capital of Copenhagen, and forced Danes to surrender their fleet, which gave Napoleon an opportunity to point out that the British were as keen on violating international law as he himself was. But it's also about economics. It's about commercial interests, because these two powers are engaged in economic competition, not just in Europe, but in Caribbean, in the Atlantic realm as a whole, in Indian Ocean, in India. I agree with you that there is less in terms of ideological element here, because the British actually welcomed the French Revolution at the start of it. If you notice, if you look at the dates on when Britain joined the war, you will see that it actually joined in 1793. The revolution was already entering its fourth year, and the entry was not occasioned necessarily by ideological difference, but as it was by political and especially geopolitical concerns that Britain had over the expanding French power. In fact, from the British point of view, the early revolutionary period from 89 to 1793 was very, very similar to what the British themselves did between 1688 and 1714, when they overthrew the monarchy. Right, the Stuart monarchy was gone, when they effectively laid the foundation for the constitutional monarchical system, creating this glorious revolution, laying down the Bill of Rights, and constraining the power of monarchy. So from their point of view, French in 1789 are doing what the British themselves did in 1688. It is the later events, once the war is underway and France repels the initial invasion and then goes on counteroffensive, that is of great concern to the British, because it threatens core areas of British interest, not one of them being, for example, Low Countries or modern-day Belgium and Netherlands, which fell to the French control in 95, and the British were keenly concerned what that meant for their national security, because one of the best ways to invade the British islands are from places like Rotterdam, from Antwerp, right, from Amsterdam, where you can group the forces and then launch the expedition, like they did, for example, in 1688, right, the invasion of the British island, led by William and Mary, came from the Low Countries. So those are the considerations that play a greater role than the ideology. But it also opportunism, frankly. For example, your listeners are familiar with the Battle of Trafalgar that ends with the destruction of the French and Spanish fleets and gives the British, right, this greatest supremacy on the seas. What do we see then? Well, the British used this opportunistically to invade South Africa. They used this opportunistically to challenge Spanish imperial power in South America by invading Argentina, by fostering plans to overthrow Spanish royal authority in other parts of Latin America. And so here we see economics, power, and also opportunism.
The relationship between France and the United States was complicated, even though it was relatively young at that point. A common interpretation of the reason Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the U.S. was because, one, he needed the money, and two, he envisioned the United States as a future rival to British imperialism. If he couldn't have an American empire, he certainly didn't want the British to have one either. Do historians still accept that basic interpretation? And what was Napoleon's view of the United States, just in general?
Overall, I think you touched upon the key factors in Napoleon's decision to withdraw from North America. Personally, from my own research, I don't emphasize the money as much because we oftentimes forget that the money that we paid for the Louisiana purchase was not in cash. It was not paid on the spot. In fact, it will take the better part of a decade for Napoleon to see that money. So Napoleon knew that when he was selling Louisiana in 1803, that he's not going to get the cash right away, which is when he really needed the money. So money for me is not as important. But the notion, the key factor, as far as I'm concerned, is Napoleon's realization that he could not defend the Louisiana Territory. He came to this conclusion after the failure of the French invasion of Haiti. As we know, one of the first things Napoleon did after consolidating power in France was to reassert control in the Caribbean colonies, among which the most important was Saint-Domingue, or modern-day Haiti. But the French expedition that he sent there in 1801 became embroiled in this brutal war, one of the probably most violent, ruthless fighting of the entire period, which I discussed in the book. And the French hemorrhaged tens of thousands of troops. And by 1803, Napoleon increasingly comes to the conclusion that he either needs to escalate this conflict and send more troops to Haiti or to get out. But if he gets out, then the whole Louisiana project also is in question because Haiti is a crucial stepping stone, so the midway point for any projection of French power in the Western Hemisphere. And the fact that the war began between France and Britain in 1803 also meant that Napoleon could no longer simply freely send troops across the ocean. And so the decision is made to withdraw from Haiti, and that withdrawal then necessitates a resolution of the Louisiana Territory as well. Having said that, there is also an important element to bear in mind, and that is that whether French would have gone willingly or not, the United States was ready and willing to use force to project its interests in the French-controlled territories of Louisiana. In Louisiana, we know from the correspondence that there was seriously considered the forceful scenario of an American intervention to secure the control of New Orleans and the surrounding territory. The Bonaparte's efforts to reclaim Louisiana, for example, President Jefferson warned in a letter to Pierre Dupont de Nemours, he warned that it will cost France a war. And in one of the passages of that letter, he says, a war which will annihilate France on the ocean and place that element under the despotism of two nations, of which I'm not reconciled to the more because of my own would be one of them. So he clearly sees that if France perseveres in this imperial project in the Western Hemisphere, there will be a conflict, and France will not fare well in it because of sheer distances involved, and that the successful sides will be British and American, and Jefferson has some qualms about that. And so Napoleon knew clearly that it would cost him too much in resources, in manpower, to maintain presence in Louisiana. And he makes the strategic decision, instead of jeopardizing relationship with the United States, to actually sell the territory to the United States. And as you've said, effectively to facilitate the rise of the United States as a rival, maybe not in the short term, but certainly long term, as a rival of Britain, one that might, in time, challenge the British ascendancy on the seas, or at least find a way to counterbalance it. And I think in that he succeeded quite spectacularly.
So if we get back to Napoleon, in 1804, he famously and dramatically goes to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and the Pope is there, and he has this ceremony where he's named emperor. What's the purpose of that? He has almost complete power. Is it just narcissism, or what's the purpose of having that power, which he technically already has? And of course, he makes that symbolic gesture of taking the crown himself to ensure that, of course, with French history, that he knew that it was important that he put the crown on top of his head. But what's the purpose of that in general?
To borrow from Mel Brooks' famous movie, it's good to be the king. It's good to be emperor for a number of reasons.
It's better than first council. I got it. Ambition it plays certainly a role in this, but I think the political considerations are quite crucial. Napoleon has increasingly consolidated his power. So we know that he was chosen as the first consul in 1799, then became again in 1801. Then he was able to extend his tenure to the consulship for life. And then in August of 1802, he convinced the legislative branch to give him the right to name his own successor. Well, that is, I think, a projection, so to speak, and a gradual progression towards monarchism. And I mentioned it a bit earlier that I don't see Napoleon as the representative of the democratic ideals of the French Revolution, of the radical ideas. I see him as an enlightened despot, and the crucial word here is the despot part. He believes in the need for leadership, strong leadership, effective leadership, but leadership that is concentrated in the hands of this enlightened person, and he certainly considers himself such. There is also the reality that there were continued assassination attempts on his life. We know of a number of conspiracies against him that the royalists have organized, and we know that on at least one occasion he came very close to being assassinated. The infamous infernal machine explosion in Paris on a Christmas day that almost claimed his life. And then in 1804, actually, there is a conspiracy that the French police discovers that was seeking to kidnap and assassinate him and replace him with a prince of royal blood. And so here, Napoleon effectively convinced himself, but also he convinces the public that the only way we can remove this danger of continued assassinations is by proclaiming a hereditary system in which even if they kill me, I will be replaced by somebody of my mold, and he has the right now to designate an heir. The proclamation of empire happens in an interesting way. It's not simply that Napoleon claims it for himself, but rather he goes through, he jumps through the hoops to make sure that there is all the legality of it, so to speak, ensured. So it is in May of 1804, months before the coronation, right? It is in May that the Senate officially proclaimed empire in a special decision, and then 4 days later,
this issue, whether the French Republic should be transformed into empire and whether there should be an emperor, was actually put to the public approval in a referendum, in a plebiscite. And there is of course, we can argue whether this was an actual plebiscite or whether it was just an illusion to create an illusion of a popular support for imperial rule. But if we look at the number of votes, it is quite interesting because more than 3.5 million votes were cast in support of it, and 2,579 were against it. And even if we allow for sort of massaging, to put it politely, of data, the overwhelming preference in France was towards law and order that Napoleon stood for, or at least was associated with. In the 4 years that he has been in power already, he was able to deliver on the promises on law and order. And for anyone who lived through the decade of the turmoil like the French Revolution, the imperial rule seemed to be promising that law and order. So there was maybe not universal support for the empire, but certainly substantial support among groups of people in France.
So in 1804, he's named emperor. Austerlitz is in 1805. He's at the apex of his power. But then, of course, the size of the French Empire, it's unstable. It's difficult for him to maintain. And then there's a series of disasters that he makes. These decisions that he makes kind of weaken the French Empire dramatically. You could talk hours on each one of these, but I'm just going to name these 3 major disasters that every school child gets in world history, and maybe just rank them in the importance of the level of a disaster it was for Napoleon and for France. So, okay. This is the way that I try to get through something really complex really quickly. So
let's roll. Let's see.
Okay. So you have the Continental System, the Peninsular War, and the invasion of Russia. Those are always in the basic world history. Like I said, every school kid gets these types of interpretations. It's simplified for kids, even high school kids. It's simplified in that way. Each one of those is very complex, but which one is the most damaging and dangerous for Napoleon?
It's a great question. It's a very expansive kind of question that, as you said, we can spend a lot of time talking. I don't belong to the group of scholars who necessarily think that Continental System was a disaster. And here I want to distinguish between the Continental Blockade and Continental System. The Continental Blockade was a much more smaller in terms of the conception and scale. It entailed the self-imposed embargo of the British trade, on the British trade. That is, Napoleon didn't want to buy British products, industrial produce especially, but he was perfectly fine with the British buying the French or French product or anything that French produced. Continental System is, to me, one of the most ambitious and really interesting initiatives that Napoleon makes, because what it entailed was creation of a single economic zone across Europe. And that it's fascinating because it will be the very vision that will ultimately be fulfilled in Europe, although more than a century later. Now, granted, the European Union that we have today is, by its nature, quite different from the one Napoleon envisioned. For example, if nothing else, Napoleon didn't envision the union that he wanted to create as a union of states that are equal in their relations, or he certainly envisioned a hierarchy in which France would be at the top. In his letters, he always writes, oftentimes references that whatever we do, everything needs to be subordinate to the French interest. His favorite phrase is France above everything and everyone.
He's trying to make France great again.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's I think it's a leitmotif that is all through Napoleon's reign. In fact, since you mentioned it, later generations, right, in 1830s, 40s, all through the rest of the century, That will be the narrative. But now the subsequent governments and politicians in France will be looking to Napoleonic era, speaking how great France was then and how far it has fallen. It reminds me, for example, of Louis Blanc's famous statement when he condemns the government of France in 1840s, and he says, and it's a quote, the France is a nation of warriors doomed to impotence because it is led by shopkeepers. And of course, the nation of warriors echo is that of Napoleonic era, right? And anyways, the Continental System, what Napoleon wanted to create was the zone, essentially, where France is the superior to hegemonic power. But because it's so dominant, it can create one market, one political system, one law, one legal system, and actually one currency. But it all will be French. So it will not be a collaboration of, let's say, 36 states like it is today, but rather it will be French imposing their system on the rest of Europe. But by creating this vision of unitary economic zone where countries will be able to trade and develop the industry in a relative safety from the already industrializing British might, Napoleon certainly was actually looking down the road. And Continental System here, I think it's not an just outright disaster the way you suggested, because there are areas of the Continental System, or at least aspects of it, that are successful. There are some places in Europe that benefited from the Continental System and its development, but there are also places that the Continental System, and especially the Continental blockade, which was a part of it, had a devastating effect. So I'm a bit divided on the Continental System. And I think in terms of ranking, I think I'll rank it a little bit lower. To me, the biggest mistake, I'll say the two crucial mistakes he makes are his policies in Spain and Portugal, but Spain especially, and then ultimately the invasion of Russia. To me, that's the biggest mistake, because even the problems in Peninsula could have been handled. In the book, I make this what if kind of question. What would have happened if in 1811, early 1812, instead of taking 500,000 men, actually more than 500,000 men ultimately, into Russia, if he had left 200,000 or so under the capable leadership of his Marshal Davout, the great Iron Marshal, somewhere in Poland or East Prussia, and then he had taken the rest of the army, 250,000, 300,000, which is an astonishing size of an army, and he had marched back to Spain. Because we've seen what Napoleon was capable of doing in Spain when he went there for a couple of months in the fall of 1808. He smashed all the resistance that tried to stop his invasion. He captured Madrid. He consolidated the authority of his, for his brother, and then he left to never come back. And so the situation in Peninsula could have been dealt by Napoleon far, far better. One of my colleagues and a good friend of mine, Charles Esdale, has written an interesting book on, for example, on the French experiences in Andalusia, where we don't see that the popular notions of French facing resistance all across Spain, and these valiant Spanish partisans, guerrillas attacking and fighting and killing the French. Well, that's not the reality of Spain, across Spain. There are areas where the French were quite successful in their counterinsurgency operations. There were areas in Spain where were more peaceful, and so I think Napoleon could have resolved the situation here far more effectively. But to underscore, I think, another point is that he shouldn't have even been in this situation. When he tried to force Portugal to join the Continental blockade in 1807 and send troops through Spain, he decided to take over Spain because he believed that Spain was mismanaged. He was right. He believed that the Spanish government was ineffective, and he was right. He believed that Spain would have benefited from these liberalizing reforms that the French Revolution brought to France, and that Napoleon then consolidated. And he certainly was right about this. And we know that there were many Spaniards who welcomed the French reforms. We even have a special term for them, afrancesados. But he didn't have, as far as I'm concerned, he didn't have to do it forcibly. And what I mean by this is he didn't have to rob the Spanish monarchs of their crowns, and to do that in such a way. It's actually like one of my senior colleagues, the esteemed Professor Paul Schroeder, famously compared Napoleon's actions at Bayonne, where the Spanish royals were forced to give up their crowns, to the actions of mafioso. Where he actually threatens to break the kneecaps unless they do his bidding. He didn't have to do this. For example, we know that Spanish King Carlos was ineffective ruler. We know that. We know that his son Ferdinand was a jackass, sure, and he would not have been a particularly good ruler. But Ferdinand was a docile lad, a person who would have been, I think, ideal for Napoleon to use as a facade, as a front person for the governance. And Ferdinand was willing to play that role because he begged. If you read his letters, they are quite pathetic. The way he approaches Napoleon and begs for his support in 1808, and then effectively asked Napoleon for permission to marry one of Napoleon's relatives, so that they established this connection between the Bourbons of Spain and the Bonapartes of France. Napoleon ignored it all. He could have allowed Ferdinand to marry one of his relatives, maybe a sister, maybe a cousin, maybe a niece, some kind of connection, right? And then sent Ferdinand to Madrid, propped him up, and then used him as a cover for a reform package that could have been brought. That, I think, would have played out a bit differently, because the Spanish revolt in the spring of 1808 begins after the news that the French have taken the royal family hostage, and that they are about to seize power. So that here you see the outright usurpation. So, and we know how costly the Peninsular War was, right? Hundreds of thousands of lives lost. We still do not know the full extent of the loss of life. In my book, based on these very broad estimates, I'm arguing that at least 250,000 French have died in this war, more than 500,000 Portuguese, well over 500,000 Spaniards. There are some who talk about 2/3 Spaniards died in the span of just next 6 years. It's a colossal loss of life.
We don't have to get into the invasion of Russia. That is, everybody's kind of aware of that. It weakens his army substantially, and then he loses power. He is exiled into Elba. How does he get out of that, though? How is it even allowed? I mean, is that did you ever get that question? It's like, how does this even happen? Like, how do you even allow, and then, of course, to create a new army within the span of 100 days, able to at least stand toe-to-toe with the other European powers. How do they even allow that to happen?
Well, that's a good question. Let me pull touch upon a couple of issues here. So, oftentimes we refer to this as escape from Elba, and it was kind of an escape. But it also, we have to bear in mind that Napoleon, when he was sent to Elba, he was sent as a sovereign, as a sovereign ruler of Elba. In the end, it is. Some of your listeners might struggle finding Elba on the map. It's a speck of a dust right on the regular map of Europe. So exchanging the massive empire that he ruled for a small island, just 200 miles off the coastline of France, is quite a drastic change. But he was still a sovereign. He had his flag, the white canvas with a red band on it with 3 golden B's. He was entitled to have a small, bodyguard force, like our small army of about 1,100 men. He could even have his own ships. Now, granted, there were only a handful of them, but nonetheless. So escape, it is kind of an escape, but it's also, Napoleon had the right to, to leave the island. It was not advisable to leave the island so quickly after the end of the war when everyone was jittery, right? There are reasons why he decided to do so, and I think some of it is some of it can be explained in the mistakes that the victorious powers, the allies, the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, the British, have made when they organized the Congress of Vienna and they began restoring the overthrown governments of Europe. The first of which was the Bourbons of France, who have been in exile for better part of a quarter of a century, and now come back to France after fighting against the French Revolution, after fighting against Napoleon, and they effectively returned back home in the bandwagon of the invading foreign army, and they're installed in Paris. Of course, that leaves a bad taste in a lot of Frenchmen mouth. But then the same Bourbons then insist on reversing some of those great achievements of the revolution in Napoleon. There's a talk of reversing many of these accomplishments. And especially this is a dangerous thing when it comes to the issue of property rights. Imagine during the French Revolution, the land and the property owned by the Catholic Church was confiscated, was nationalized and sold. There was a law that proclaimed that any nobleman who fled France and refused to return would be proclaimed as an émigré, that is a political immigrant, and therefore his or her property also will be liable for confiscation and sale. All of that would be legal under the French laws as they existed at the time, and you could have bought acres of land that belonged to the church or belonged to the nobleman, knowing that this was legal under the revolutionary and Napoleonic laws. But now, in 1814, with the return of these early, prior owners, there is a spectrum kind of, right, the thread, the shadow of this restoration of the property rights, in which you can lose your property bought decades earlier because of the return of these recalcitrant, right, nobles, the ultra royalists. The Bourbons also made their own, share of mistakes in terms of that. They didn't have a good PR agent, somebody who would have sold the vision of the Bourbon future, just like Napoleon did his. I mean, Napoleon was a master propagandist. The Bourbon decision to reduce the size of the French army is understandable because France is a defeated nation. France doesn't need to have a large army, and it is a gesture also on the part of the Bourbon king of reassuring the rest of Europe that France has given up on its former aggressive policy and pushing around the neighbors, and that France wants to be in peace and at peace with the neighbors. But the decision to reduce the size of the army meant that thousands, we can talk about tens of thousands of soldiers whom Napoleon treated as an elite, now find themselves cast aside, thrown to the streets with barely anything to sustain them. And so there is a lot of grievance that is in France, grievance of political nature, of cultural nature, of social nature. And you touched upon this point of making France great again. Right? And that actually is an important element here as well in the story, which I always tell my own students that humans have this remarkable ability to misremember things. History experience and history remembered. Again, history experience and history remembered are two completely different things. This very soldier who might have complained and grumbled about the war, who would have been freezing his butt off somewhere in frozen, the plains of Russia or in the mountains of Spain, and would have grumbled about, the Napoleon's policies. Now, just a year later, would have remembered that in a very different light and would have spoken with pride about his experiences and would have spoken about, with pride about France being respected and feared as opposed to this defeated nation. And so there is a sense of, we were great once, and now with this new government, inept government, not particularly qualified government, and especially the government who fought against us for so long, that there is need for change. And Napoleon is well aware of it. He has a lot of supporters who maintain communications with him through a variety of means, and they keep him well appraised of the developments in France, and which is why in the early spring of 1815, he makes that remarkable decision to leave the island and return. Now, he was very careful to wait until the commissioners, which the victorious power sent to the island, until the commissioners were preoccupied. So famously, he waited until the British commissioner, Sir Neil Campbell, left the island to go allegedly to see his mistress in Florence, which was a good excuse to travel. But Napoleon waited for him to leave and then effectively embarked on this remarkable return. I'm a bit divided about it because on one hand, the flight of the eagle, as Napoleon's return to France is known or has become known, it is one of the most astonishing stories. It's tinted in these romantic colors. It is a story of this one man taking on a nation and prevailing. Right? It has so many elements to it. Think about the scene at the village of La Fraye, when Napoleon confronts a royal army, several thousand strong, that was sent to intercept him. In that famous scene, when he walks alone towards that line of the royal troops, and he recognizes the soldiers, and he gives that famous speech, right? Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, I've heard your grumbles, and I've come to help you. If you want to shoot your emperor, right? Here's the emphasis on that. I'm your man. If you want to shoot your emperor, here I am, shoot. And then no one fires at him. I mean, that creates this, it creates and sustains Napoleonic legend that is so powerful, that still survives to the present day. But on the other side, I cannot imagine a scenario, and certainly hindsight allows, is a benefit to us, but I cannot imagine a scenario in which Napoleon could have prevailed in 1815. As soon as he returned, the Congress of Vienna condemned him as an outlaw. As soon as he returned, the great powers issued a statement saying that they will not make a peace treaty with him and that they will be determined to fight him to the end. And even if he was not defeated at Waterloo in June of 1815, he would have been defeated somewhere else, in some other small village in Rhineland, maybe. Since even if he had defeated the British and the Prussians, there was still more than 500,000 Russians and Austrians coming towards France. So that gamble that Napoleon makes is, to me, unjustified, because it claimed so many lives, because it left France far in worse shape than it was before Napoleon's return.
So the last question I have, if you take the Napoleonic Wars, how much connective tissue is between the Napoleonic Wars and the nationalism and the militarism of the 20th century? The rise of Mussolini in Italy, the rise of the Nazis in Germany. How much is that too much of a stretch, or is there some connective tissue there?
I think we can find some connective tissue. I'm not the subscriber to the notion that Napoleon was the direct precursor to Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. There are some books written about that group them all together, because Napoleon is a different kind of political animal. Now he does, his importance in the connective tissue that he talked about, I think, can be seen in the type of state that he built. It is a state based on complete centralization of power. It is a state that is built on on aspiration of complete control of public opinion. It is a state that we can identify as the first modern style police state. Napoleon indeed develops this modern style policing of the population. You should see the mounds of reports that he's receiving from all across France, police reports from these local levels, from the district levels, about what people are thinking, what they're talking about. And it is really startling to see these men consuming this information. I mean, the amount of information is simply daunting, but his ability to devour that information, to analyze and process it is really startling. But it doesn't hide the fact that Napoleon does create this a system that is precursor in elements of it to the totalitarian systems to come later. However, again, as I said, I'm not supportive of portraying Napoleon as a Hitler or Stalin, because he never attempted to pursue a racial purity. He never rounded up hundreds of thousands of people and put them in concentration camps. He never pursued the policies, those extremist policies of the totalitarian regimes. But as I mentioned, he develops those core elements that later on contribute to the rise of totalitarian system. The nationalism is a byproduct of French Revolution, and Napoleon, through his conquest, facilitates the spread of this nationalist sentiment. His occupation of Germany and the transformations he brought to Germany did play a role in the rise of German nationalism. And certainly by 1813, you see the talk about the Germans rising and uniting against the French domination. You see the French occupation of Spain contributing to the shaping up of the Spanish sense of national identity. So in that sense, yes, that plays an important role. In militarism, I don't see as much of a connection. Now, Napoleonic War was, in terms of its scale and intensity, one of the largest conflicts in early modern history. But once it is over, you do see a certain demilitarization going on. And I think the militarism of the 20th century has more to do with the concluding decades of the 19th century, with the arms race between Britain and Germany, with the German unification wars, with the Italian unification wars, rather than necessarily dealing with the Napoleon at the beginning of the century.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mikaberidze. I really appreciated it. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this discussion.
I would like to thank my guest today, Dr. Alexander Mikaberidze, for his fascinating discussion on the Napoleonic Wars. If you would like to get his book, The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, all you have to do is click on the link in the description below. It is an excellent and comprehensive study of the Napoleonic Wars and their impact on world history. The featured brew was Little Napoleon IPA from the Pensacola Bay Brewery in Florida. And if you liked our conversation today, please share the episode with a friend and remember to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get new episodes immediately after they are released. Subscribing is the only way to get new episodes right away. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, who are producing new material as we speak, and of course, we're looking forward to that. To the growing list of listeners from 40 countries, hundreds of cities across the United States, I would like to say thank you very much. I really appreciate it. There are many more great episodes on the way, from discussions on a young JFK, Alaric, and the political philosophy of the Founding Fathers. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.